It's a special lecture offered by Dr. Michael Yates. He was very kind to come over to deliver this lecture. The title of the lecture is the Narratology of the Graphic, exploring the narrativity of the contemporary graphic novel. So this is right up Michael's alley of research. I mean, he's a narratologist working on a postmodernist tradition, and he's just telling me that this new project that she's working on, the project on the collage, which is about visual culture and visual narratives. I'm really looking forward to hearing more about it as we go on. And I believe this particular lecture draws on that project a little bit. So he's happy to answer questions on that as well if you have any at the end. So what we'll do is we'll let him deliver the lecture, and maybe towards the end we can make it a Q&A session where you can ask questions directed at him. So without further ado, I request Michael to take over. Thank you.
In his introductory chapter of Story and Discourse of 1978, Seymour Chapman briefly outlines the relationship of narrative and poetics. He describes the fundamental practices of narrative theory and provides a general sketch of the semiotics of narrative structure. Published in the same year, Will Eisner's A Contract with God, first published in 1978, introduces the term graphic novel into the greater cultural lexicon of the arts and the humanities, and of course also the publishing industry, which is not something to take lightly. However, beyond the simple historical simultaneity, what also links these two works and their respective authors is the fact that not only did Chapman's study of narratology initiate its analysis of story and discourse through the use of an almost purely graphic text, which was a comic strip, but Eisner, who is most famous as being a comic book writer, was later to publish two of the most influential volumes on the semiotic analysis of graphic narrative: Comics and Sequential Art in 1985, and Graphic Storytelling and Visual Narrative in 1996. So we've got a narratologist using comic strips and a comic artist writing about narrative theory, so all at the same time. And yet, despite the auspicious early correlation of Chapman's graphic conscious narratology and Eisner's introduction of the graphic novel into mainstream literary discourse, in the years following the publication of these texts, there's been no deficit of debate surrounding these terms and terminologies, especially those introduced by Chapman's conception of narratology and Eisner's designation as a graphic novelist. Right? The whole idea of what is a graphic novelist, are these novels, really started at the end of the 70s and snowballed through the 80s. It's still a debate. Right. Indeed, at the same time of this study that I'm doing right now, several recently published studies in both of these areas, so comic book studies but also narratology, they begin with very self-conscious acknowledgments of the theoretical divide that continues to mark the border between the narratological and the graphical. Although each of these scholars that are publishing now is just as anxious to admit that the mutual understanding remains crucial to the continued development of these two fields. So they back off while recognizing the importance of collaboration. It's an awkward moment for sort of graphic literary studies. Anyway, so the obvious questions posed by this theoretical divide are: how did narratology lose its direct connection to the visual language of the graphic? And how can this connection be reestablished? In this workshop, I hope to discuss some of the factors influencing the ongoing discrepancy between narratology and comics scholarship, and proceed to suggest a means of reintroducing graphic narrative back into the realm of contemporary narratology. Later, in the third section of this workshop, I'll then apply this revised approach to the narratological analysis of the visual language of the graphic narrative, using some examples from Art Spiegelman, Bryan O'Malley, and Chris Ware. Then finally, I'll conclude this workshop by talking about contemporary scholarship and how further interdisciplinary and mutually engaged dialogue can occur between narratological studies and comic scholarship. And of course, some of you may be more well-versed with comic studies than others. I know talking about comic studies in Japan is a very hairy proposition because many of my students know more about it than I do. Right? They've grown up on comics and manga, and their ability to understand the graphic is incredible. So let's move to the theoretical divide. So, primary to an assessment of how contemporary narratology lost touch with comic scholarship, especially as concerns the visual language of graphic narrative, is an examination of where Chapman's narratological analysis left off and what more recent theories and definitions of narrative say about the field of narratology at the present moment. So, what is the basis of Chapman's narratology? And what are the theoretical sources of his approach? From the outset, Chapman explicitly states that the dualist and structuralist study of narrative, presented in his first book here, might best be thought of as a continuation and synthesis of the ideas and critical practices introduced by French structuralists such as Roland Barthes, Tsvetan Todorov, and Gerard Genet. And with this structuralist tradition and its theoretical background, Chapman indicates that the general intention of his study is to posit a what and a way of narratological analysis. Chapman continues, the what of narrative I call the story, and the way I call its discourse. So he's based on this structuralist tradition, but he's trying to bring it a little bit forward through a synthesis. However, it's safe to think of Chapman's project as classical narratology, right? Very much old school narratology. In further definition of what he views as the what and way of story and discourse, Chapman suggests a framework for the structural analysis of narrative that focuses on the textual object as a communication composed of narrative statements. And so very much he has a communicative approach to what narrative is, right? It's saying something, it's communicating something, ideally between author and reader. So here's a quote from his work. Narrative discourse consists of a connected sequence of narrative statements, where statement is quite independent of the particular expressive medium, right, which is something to keep in mind as we go on. It includes dance statement, linguistic statement, graphic statement, and so on. Narrative statement and to state narratively are used here as technical terms for any expression of a narrative element viewed independently of its manifesting substance, right? So it's society, it's culture. Narratives are communications thus easily envisaged as the movement of arrows from left to right, or in Japan, right to left, right? From implied author to implied audience. What is communicated is story, the formal content element of narrative, and it is communicated by discourse, right? The medium, the formal expression element. As specified in this passage, Chapman's structural approach to narrative considers the what of the story as both separable from and directly related to the way of the discourse and form, right? The structure of the relations between these paired components accordingly shapes the nature of the communicated narrative. Right? So how you say it makes the narrative. However, what is most significant, at least for the purposes of today's workshop, is not only that Chapman's structural overview considers the formal content of narrative in relation to the formal expression of narrative, but also that this approach provides a broad theoretical framework for the transmedial analysis of narrative as a communication composed of statements that can be delivered through gestural, right, through dance, gestural modes of discourse, verbal modes of discourse, such as linguistic statements, obviously, and visual modes of communication as well, such as the graphic statement of a comic book. But before we return to the topic of discourse analysis and its central importance to the interpretation of graphic narrative, we must first fast forward 3 or 4 decades and briefly consider where and when narratology shifted its direction, or in other words, where the narratological epicenter of this divide is actually located. Firstly, it's necessary to recognize that recent theoretical approaches to the definition of narrative have not denied the importance of the kind of structural analysis made by Chapman. Right? He's still very much a respected narratologist. However, the contemporary move away from structuralist narratology, right, or classical narratology, towards a more cognitive narratology, right, having to do with thought, eye tracking, etc., habitual processes of textual analysis, for example, and also new cultural ways of cognizance. Right? So those aspects have been recently brought into narratology. Okay. For the cognitive narratologist, the movement of arrows from left to right, or right to left, as in Japan, is most significant for its introduction of what David Herman terms mind relevance, or what Marie-Laure, who is one of the people we'll be focusing on today, refers to as the cognitive construct or mental image built by the interpreter in response to the text. Right? So she's very much in a reader response sense, thinking about that relationship. Right? The texts are not so much a script so much as a play between author and reader, but also author and text, and also text and reader all at the same time. That whole network of relationships is central to Ryan's approach. Right? And this reverses the polarities of the structuralist analysis, right? Seen as a negotiation between an implied author and an implied audience, right? As Chapman brings up. Cognitive analytical practices tend to be more directly concerned with the negotiations involved between an actual author and an actual audience in the construction of an implied text. Right? So it's the text that is unclear. Right? We have an actual author, we have an actual living reader, but it's the text that is unclear. Right? What is actually being communicated is suddenly the focus of cognitivist narratology. Right. So, following the lead of similar generic, natural or cognitive categorizations of narrative by other narratologists such as Gerald Prince, Monica Fludonick, and David Herman, Ryan's categorical assessment in Narrative Across Media moves Chapman's communicative model into the cognitive realm by arguing that narrative does not simply denote the textual act of representation. Instead, narrativity presupposes the capacity to generate the cognitive construct of an imagined story world. Right? So the text's whole purpose is to create a world in your mind. Right? If a story world has been conjured, then you're probably dealing with a narrative. Right? That's her definition, her very broad, generic definition. Right? But it's still very much cognitively based. Right? It's going on within your imagination. Right. So rather than narrativity being immanent within the story, right, somehow mysteriously present in the book, right, it's all about the relations of the text itself. So Ryan's cognitive approach states that a text must bring to mind the following representations in order to be considered a narrative. So let's look at Ryan's kind of checklist. So this is her first term. She says, a narrative text must create a world and populate it with characters and objects. Logically speaking, this condition means that the narrative text is based on propositions asserting the existence of individuals and on propositions ascribing properties to these existence. So you need characters, and they need to be doing something, right? And a mannequin isn't enough, right? You can't just have a character and leave that person on their own. Like, things have to occur, which brings us to the second stage. Right? The world referred to by the text must undergo changes of state that are caused by non-habitual physical events, either accidents, happenings, or deliberate human actions. These changes create a temporal dimension and place the narrative world in the flux of history. Right? So you can see some development here. Right? In order for you to have a narrative, we need this world to exist with characters, and it has to be within the flux of history. Right? It can be its own history. It can have its own physics, its own rules of behavior and morals and ethics and biology, etc. Right? So science fiction is not being denied here, but it has to have its own sort of space-time continuum. And the third point, the text must allow the reconstruction of an interpretive network of goals, plans, causal relations, and psychological motivations around the narrated events. This implicit network gives coherence and intelligibility to the physical events and turns them into a plot. Right, so if you check these three boxes, according to Ryan, you've got yourself a narrative. Right? So you need characters, you need a story world, and there needs to be some sort of internal mental capacity for these characters to be at least human-like in their psychological motivations, etc. Right, so those are Ryan's prerequisites. When a script fulfills these conditions, Ryan explains, it creates a narrative script. So far, there does not appear to be anything in this approach that might suggest a truly radical departure from the structuralist method by Chapman earlier. Indeed, other than the general suggestion of the audience's active cognition during the interpretive process, Ryan's three conditions of narrative appear to conform to a pattern not unlike the framework of narrative that we've already seen from Chapman, right? The so-called classical analysis of narrative events, right? However, immediately following this itemized 1, 2, 3 list, Ryan asks, how compatible is this formula with non-verbal forms of narrative? To which she responds, rather than locating narrativity in an act of telling, my definition anchors it in two distinct realms. And in the demarcation of these two realms, Ryan contends that the fully functioning semiotic object of the narrative script, right, the narrative itself, necessarily implies a spectrum of narrative that spans between the two modalities of intentionality, so intentionally being a narrative, and potentially having narrativity. Right? That's her spectrum. Right? It's either intentionally made and created as a story narrative, or it could be someday turned into a narrative. In further classification of the terms of this approach, Ryan states, the property of being, and she puts that in scare quotes, the property of being a narrative can be predicated on any semiotic object produced with the intent of evoking a narrative script in the mind of the audience. Having narrativity, on the other hand, means that something is able to evoke such a script. In addition to life itself, pictures, music, or dance can have narrativity without being narratives in a literal sense. And that's where the divide really sort of suddenly thrusts itself into the earth as a big crack between these two areas of study. Right? We can have a script, but maybe it's not narrative, is what Ryan is suggesting. And for comic scholars, for anybody in visual literacy, that's a bit of a shocking statement. How can it have narrativity but not be a narrative? Right? So that's where today's workshop is going next, to explore that. Right, so back to Ryan. The fullest form of narrativity occurs, Ryan maintains, when the text is both intended as narrative and possesses sufficient narrativity to be construed as such. So if it's consciously made as a narrative, and also the reader sees it as a narrative, then to her it's perfect 100% grade A narrative. Right? It's got the seal of approval. However, without taking issue with the inherently problematic intentionalism in Ryan's proposed modal spectrum, right, it is nevertheless very necessary to wonder, what exactly is this literal sense that is being imposed here by Ryan? Right? Especially if something is said to have sufficient narrativity. And it's incredibly vague. And furthermore, why is it that nonverbal texts, as well as other nonverbal means of storytelling, such as dance, why are they here conceived to be somehow non-literal in their narrativity? What is non-literal about the language of a gesture, or sign language for that matter, right? So I think there's something missing. In order to answer these questions, Ryan reveals the verbal bias inherent in her approach to the question of the narrative text. For according to Ryan, it seems clear that of all the semiotic codes, language is the best suited to storytelling. That's what she says. Every narrative can be summarized in language, but very few can be retold through pictures exclusively, end quote. Of course, this response fails to adequately recognize the semiotic interplay and the subtle communicative capacity of gestural linguistics, again, sign language, for example, not to mention the formal complexity of other visual forms of language, such as diagrammatic discourse, the visual language of graphic narrative, as we'll see. But putting all of these aside for the moment and returning to Ryan, it is necessary to locate the precise terms of this verbal bias and determine its literal relation to the theoretical divide suggested earlier. In her appeal to previous studies, such as Saulworth's Pictures Can't Say Ain't, and Shlomith Riemann Keenan's How the Model Neglects the Medium, Ryan states that visual media lack the code, the grammar, and the syntactic rules necessary to articulate specific meanings. Right? She falls back on rhetoric. Right? How can a picture have grammar? How can a visual narrative have any kind of code or syntax? Is her sort of default position. Right? If it doesn't have this kind of grammar, code, and syntax, it can't be narrative. Right? Only verbal forms of storytelling, to her, can have that. But I'm suggesting today that no, that's not the case. Right? Comic books have their own visual or even multimodal means of encoding, creating their own syntax, their own timing, visually, and also verbally. So that's what we're going to look at today. So, back to the divide. An important hint at the reason for this verbal bias can be found in the general narratological attitude towards the question of nonverbal graphic narrativity. Indeed, any textual object lacking a conventional manner of verbal encoding, of grammatical structuring, and of syntagmatic inscription is excluded from the literal narrativity on this very basis. However, even the most cursory engagement with graphic narrative, right, even just a quick look at a comic strip, demonstrates that the code, grammar, and syntax of the graphic is precisely the complex that binds the graphic narrative together. Right? It has a very obvious grammar, code, and syntax, despite its lack of necessary verbal connectivity. Right. So that's what we're going to look at today. So in an attempt to better articulate the code, grammar, and syntax of the graphic narrative, today we'll be looking at three sort of sample cases. We'll be looking briefly at Art Spiegelman's Mouse, which maybe you're familiar with. We'll also look at Bryan Lee O'Malley's Scott Pilgrim, and we'll also look at Chris Ware's Jimmy Corrigan, The Smartest Kid on Earth. And I think Chris Ware is my favorite, my personal favorite. So if you've heard of him or you're interested in Chris Ware's works, I'm happy to talk about it. And if you're not aware of Chris Ware, then you should check him out. He's a brilliant storyteller and an incredible illustrator. Very, very detailed. I hope you would enjoy it if you give it a chance. So, through this approach today to the visual language of the contemporary graphic novel, the precise terms of the narrativity of these narrative scripts will be considered, and the multimodal practices involved in both the creation and the interpretation of these texts will be explored. In order to continue, however, it is important to first define the encoding practices typical of narrative. So let's look at coding here. So we've seen all that. So these will be the texts we're looking at. So in the Routledge Encyclopedia of Narrative, Michael Kearns defines code thusly. He says, codes enable communication by establishing a common ground on which the producer and the receiver of an utterance can meet. They've been compared to other human systems such as the rules of a game and the conventions of etiquette. A code for the reading of narrative can be understood as a loose set of rules by which a person identifies and interprets the essential components of a narrative text. Right, so it's, again, a communicative device. He goes on. Initially recognizing the text as a narrative, a reader will then apply the proeretic code to organize the text actions. So I'll stop there for a moment. Proeretic. The term proeretic, it was meant by Roland Barthes to represent action in a sequence, right? if you have a hermeneutic process, right, of course, you're revealing the mystery, right? Agatha Christie, Arthur Conan Doyle rely heavily on the hermeneutic code, right? Because we know there's a murder, and the whole narrative is to find out who did it, right? Or what led up to the death, right? That's hermeneutic. But the proeretic is, we have a gunslinger, right? In my example, and he shoots, but we don't know if he was successful. We don't know if he got shot, right? The proeretic leads from action to action, and the suspense is maintained through that unknowing, right? So it's slightly different than the suspense of the hermeneutic, right? So that's one of the codes. The next code, the referential code, to connect the text world to accepted bodies of knowledge. The semic code, to organize its characters and characterizing details. The symbolic code, to follow the text development of narrative suspense. And the metacodic code, by which the text signals, the reader infers, and the culture suggests what codes are appropriate for a given text. Right. So as you can see, each of these codes are not mutually exclusive to the others. Right? There's quite a bit of overlap between these coding practices. But I think it's still safe to add a further code. I think the suggestion of a graphic code would help to develop this further, right? So to this might be added the graphic code, by which the reader filters each of these encoding systems through the visual organization of a graphic text's formal layout, its visual style, its chromatics, right, the colors or lack of color, and its selected modes of inscription, right? So does this comic artist have a wiggly, jagged hand like Charles Schulz for the Peanuts comic, right? It has a roughness to it, but it's a familiar roughness, right? It's a human roughness, right? As you'll see with Chris Ware, there's a kind of inhuman cleanness to his lines and his colors, right? It has a certain plastic quality to it, right? But that's an important part of the language of the story he's telling, right? How the author or artist creates it gives it a certain nuance, right? And none of these other codes really appreciate that level of nuance. Good. One of the most obvious and significant differences between the encoding and decoding practices of verbal narrative and those of the graphic novel involves the spatio-temporal dimension, right? Space-time. Right? When you're reading a story, you're taking up real, actual time. But the time in the comic strip reading experience is different. Right? It's tinkered with by the artist. Right? So the spatio-temporal dimensions of the textual material slightly different than on the page the page of a graphic novel, whether or not it employs verbal information, narration, or dialogue, allows for an immediate multiplicity of reading practices and decoding techniques. As a multimodal text, the graphic novel typically confronts the reader with a sequence of framed events that must be deciphered before there's any kind of order or relationship placed on the text. This reading is processed on both a global and a local scale, because the visual layout of the graphic novel allows, and sometimes even requires, the reader to survey the visual contents on the page prior to commencing a closer reading of the panels. Right? So many works these days require a double reading, but some of them even a triple reading. Right? So when you open the page, you're automatically reading because the layout strikes your eye. Right? And some layouts are not immediately accessible. You need to find out where to start. Right? the assumption that you're going to go from left to right or right to left is often played with by the artist. Or you end up with a page that's circular or triangular or bent or blank, right? Where do you start when the page is blank? Right? So that kind of reading process is both immediate and then more precise and local as you look at the panels. And then perhaps before you turn the page again, you're doing another global reading. So the reading process is altogether different. Right? The circularity of these reading processes thus involves the reader in a two-stage decoding of the presented narrative material. The first global reading takes in the layout, style, mode of the text. And this primary reading is followed by the local reading that attempts to connect each of the textual elements into the sequence of a narrative that makes the relationship of these elements appear to relate in some meaningful way. Right? So you're trying to cognitively construct it, right? But you're doing that yourself. Right. In other words, the initial global reading is a survey of the overall import of the text from a wide perspective, and the secondary local reading is an engagement with the precise encoding and decoding of the narrative from a specific heuristic perspective, right? So you're decoding on a very local level there. Both of these interrelated reading practices inform the reader as to the sequence, mode, and function of the panels as they suggest a system of vectors that order the reading process and emphasize or imply a certain reading pattern that might best be described as the spatiotemporal relations between depicted events. So there's often a suggestion of vectors, right? There might not be arrows, but there might be actual arrows telling you how to read the bits. Dotted lines, darts, for example, or outlinings. Maybe the color changes. We go from dim to dark, or dark to light. Right? So the artist is expected, we expect the artist to give us a way of reading. Right? If we get a jumble on the page, maybe we give up immediately, and that would defeat the purpose. So the author and artist are very aware of that relationship. Right? They don't want to let the reader down, because it's always a dodgy proposition when you give something unreadable, when you give them what Barthes calls the red-hot text, right? That is just textual and little else. So I think especially authors today are very aware that they're appealing to a new audience. Okay, let's see. Right. While there is a vast number of structural and cognitive processes involved in both of these reading practices, for brevity's sake, today I'll be focusing on the symbolic nature of the graphic encoding and how these coded elements can be juxtaposed to suggest the sequence that forms the basis of graphic narrative. So let's look at one of the most prominent graphic narrative scholars today, Scott McCloud. He states, symbolic expressions don't rely on an understanding of real facial expressions to work. A simple doodle or two is usually all it takes. Some graphic symbols begin their lives as simple pictures of actual physical reactions such as sweat, then drift into the more abstract territory of pure symbols such as darts. Others are strictly metaphorical and require you, the artist, and your audience to both know the code before the message can get through. Symbolic expressions are closer to the written word in the sense that their meaning is fixed regardless of how they're rendered. Just as a word means the same thing regardless of handwriting or font choice. So, to give you an example, can I use this? So, very simple stick figure, right? Unhappy, right? This figure has been giving us a symbolic vocabulary of unhappiness, right? Of course, you've probably seen something similar before, right? So you've been taught the language of this symbol, right? But once an artist uses it in his graphic text, he's relying on this vocabulary, right? Otherwise, this would just be some circles and lines, right? He's expecting you to recognize this as a humanoid face with eyes and a mouth, feeling in a certain way, right? It has an emotional content implied by the lines over the eyes, right? How you tilt the lines changes the emotion that you're trying to convey, right? This is the language of the graphic, right? These are and follow grammatical rules, codes, and a syntax, right? And if you betray it, then you lead to lack of communication, right? Even one line changes it altogether, right? What is he feeling? Confusion? Nausea? We have no idea what he's feeling. Okay, so that's really what the graphic artist is playing with, right? And that's what Scott McCloud is suggesting here. According to McCloud, the conventions of use and connotation that order meaning within the visual language of the graphic are not unlike the mechanisms of the literal alphabetical encoding in verbal language. Both of these systems are built upon the contextual positioning of symbols and decoding practices that serve to connect these symbols to some conventional pattern of usage and the meanings attached to each particular instance of usage. So we have a word for the smiley face or the sad face, right? It has a specific emotive but also verbal meaningful aspect, right? We can locate it, we can name it, regardless of whether it's graphic or not. Applying this theory to a brief reading of a set of panels from Spiegelman's Mouse should be sufficient to demonstrate how this occurs within the graphic text. So let's have a look at some panels from Mouse here. So this is in the introduction to Art Spiegelman's Mouse, and as any good introduction will do, it introduces us to the characters and creates a certain context for the reading of the novel. So in these panels, we meet Art, right, who is the author's avatar, and we also meet Art's father, Vladek, who is in a certain sense the narrator of Mouse, the narrative. So we are introduced to these two characters. We can see the kind of bonds that they have, the father-son relationship. And we're also introduced to an interesting kind of philosophy, right? In these panels, Art falls down, he hurts his knee, and he's complaining about his friends. "Ah, my friends left me." And Vladek says, "Friends? Oi! Once you're locked in a room with no food for a week, then you could see what is friends," he says. Right? So his English seems to be slightly different. It's not standard, right? And we learn as the narrative goes on, he's Polish, he's of Jewish ancestry, etc. And we start to learn about the Nazi occupation of Poland, etc. Right? So in this beginning, we get a taste for Vladek's personality. We're introduced to another world. We're brought into the story world of the novel, right? And it's done so in a very standard, very conventional way, right? This is not a comic strip that should be difficult for most of us to read, right? It follows patterns that we're used to. He changes things up later on, but it's always safe to begin with something that might be accessible. Let's look to the next pattern. When we start to think about code, we have to start to think about what things are being encoded, right? Even just lines on the face and ways of depicting the characters has its own language of emotion, has its own language of impact on the development of the story. So let's have a look at some of these symbols. Right. So as the character Vladek, and Vladek kind of leaps in and out of time. Right? He's both simultaneously in Regio Park, New York, and he's also simultaneously back in Poland as he tells the story. So it has a very interesting play with temporal here and with time frames within the narrator's mind. So as the character Vladek recounts certain aspects of his life in Poland to his son Art, the story briefly describes Vladek's courtship of Anya, and we see that here, as well as Vladek's prior romantic attachment to a character named Lucia, so another mouse. Right? And because we're not familiar with maybe mouse facial expressions, etc., it gives the artist a new place to go, right? A new set of challenges as well, as we'll see. Over the course of these two facing pages, several distinct meanings are encoded symbolically without any need for further verbal signposting. Right, so as we can see here in the third panel, the shading to Anya's face indicates embarrassment. She's speaking in English. She thinks that Vladek doesn't understand English, and he calls her out and says, "I can speak English." And her face reddens. Right? In a black and white comic, we can't show red or pink, so we have to shade it. So there's a language to that shading for embarrassment. Right? And this is a perfect example. Right? Hand before the mouth, shading. Okay, we read that as embarrassment. In the fourth panel of figure 4 here, the steeply inclined lines above the eyes of both characters indicates they're both angry. They're having a bit of a fight. In the fifth panel, the dark shading of Lucia's face indicates the darkness of depression and dread. And in the final panel, the U-shaped symbol beneath Lucia's eye indicates that she's crying. Right? So this symbolic language can be decoded and made into verbal language quite easily. While these examples are unexceptional, and indeed most of us can quite obviously have a proficiency of decoding them, what is exceptional about this is its efficiency, right? The efficiency of this symbolic code, the tremendous nuance that it adds to the meaning of each of these panels in this sequence, and also the simple fact that a visual fluency in decoding these symbols can be acquired. Right? So it's something that shouldn't be underestimated, but it often is underestimated. So now that the basis of reading has been established, the question remains as to how these elements and the panels in which they operate unite to create a grammatical sequence. So where's the grammar? Okay, if we have a language, what is the grammar of the graphic? According to MacLeod, the crucial component of the interaction that takes place in the creation and comprehension of graphic narrative is closure. Let's skip to that. And in this panel, he describes closure. As MacLeod illustrates in these panels here, the cognitive process that occurs in the space between the panels and the symbolic elements of the text is precisely the sequencing process that allows us to connect these unconnected graphic moments and mentally construct a continuous, unified reality. But otherwise, all of the panels would sit or float in their own story worlds. Right? It's that closure that allows us to create a sequence, a cognizable sequence that gels into a story in our head as we read. It's that process that is necessary. And he calls that closure. Right? So, as we can see, in between these, there's a lot of suggestion going on in the mind. Right? In order for these to have closure, in order for them to connect, this axe-wielding maniac probably has to kill or at least hit the other character with his axe. Hence we get this, yeah! Right? Of course, there are many different kinds of closure. Sometimes the closure is not perfect, right? Or is meant to create confusion in the reader. Here I think it's quite obvious. Right? But the point that Scott McCloud brings up that I think is the most important is that all of this occurs in the gutter. Right? And the gutter is the space between panels. Right? That's where your mind is asked to go into action. The graphic artist gives us clues for some sort of sequence, but all of the imagination, all of the story world really exists within your own cognition, right? Up in your head. That's where these connections are made. Right? Otherwise, they would float alone. They wouldn't have any kind of sequential action at all. McCloud continues, if visual iconography is the vocabulary of comics, closure is its grammar. And since our definition of comics hinges on the arrangement of elements, then in a very real sense, comics is closure, according to McCloud. But what exactly is the grammar of closure? Taking a set of characteristic examples from Bryan O'Malley's Scott Pilgrim, we can see the cognitive process of closure. So let's have a look at O'Malley here. So again, there's a lot of action going on in between the panels. So in the first panel, we start to establish that meaningful glances are taking place at this party, right? Scott, I'll tell you the story very briefly. It's super simple. Scott has 2 girlfriends. Okay, it's not that complicated, but it causes problems for him. And at this moment, both girls are in the same room, and he's having trouble coping with the anxiety. So as we see at the bottom, he runs away. Ah! Oh no! So this is the moment where everyone realizes that Scott has 2 girlfriends and they're both here at the same time. So these darts between the panels at the top indicate those meaningful glances. And it's our job to put those panels into a grammatical sequence of she looked at him, he looked at her, she looked at him, he looked at her, etc. Right? And those darts give us a direction towards the character that is making that meaningful glance occur. So it's following very much a kind of sentence structure of subject, action, predicate. And then we have a nice kind of period at the end of the statement here at the bottom. Right, so very much a one-page sentence structure. Let's move on to the next example. So here we have a very typical fight scene. But the transitions here, I think, are worth a little bit of consideration, especially when we start to talk about grammar and syntax. So following McCloud's definition of the term, closure specifies the meaning by which time and motion are described or implied graphically. Right? So this is a kind of time signature. And in McCloud's taxonomy of the term, closure typically occurs through the following 6 6 types of panel-to-panel or element-to-element transition. Right? There are different kinds of transitions, just as in film, right? Different wipes and filters and cuts. Comics has the same. So 6 of them. There's moment-to-moment, so time progressing, such as in these sequences. Action to action, right? There's some action to action transitions going on here as well. Subject to subject, right? In a dialogue especially, or as you zoom in on a place, right? Subject to subject or scene to scene is another way. Aspect to aspect, especially when you are describing a space, maybe the windows, the chairs, the audience, the podium, right? So we're moving from subject to subject or aspect to aspect. And also non sequitur transitions, right? Suddenly we have Charlie Brown walking down the street with his poodle, not his poodle, his beagle, Snoopy, and then suddenly Snoopy turns into a potato. Right? It doesn't make any sense. Right? So non sequitur transitions are also an option for the artist. So let's look at these panels. The panels in figure 6, that was the last one, according to MacLeod's terminology, are an example of moment-to-moment transitions, right? Something occurring in a sequence. These transitions require very little closure in cognitively connecting the panels into a semblance of logical sequential order over an implied period of time. Right? It makes sense because they look similar enough that you can follow it and think, okay, things are happening in that story world, right? And time is taking place. Okay, let's look at this scene. Let's see. Where am I again? Thus, in this scene, the reader easily infers that Scott Pilgrim has caused some anxiety. Let's go back. Right, he's caused some anxiety to develop among his friends. The darts indicate that rapid progression of meaningful glances as the sequence flashes from moment to moment. Right? In figure 7 here on the left, but also in figure 8, the transitions alternate between subject to subject and action to action and back to subject to subject. This alternating arrangement allows the characters to be viewed from a variety of perspectives. It also describes the passage of time and suggests the shape of the space in which they exist. Connected into a unified pattern describing a set of characters, events, and existence within a specified story world, to use Ryan's term, the closure that completes each sequential process of implied actions shows us how this story goes forward in time. Right? And as we'll see later, the shape of the panels, the size of the panels, even the colors used in this panel, in these panels, gives us a certain sense of how much time they're taking. Right? Small panels, small time. Big panels could take quite a while. Right? So the artist is asking you to spend more time and to sort of imply more time into the size and shape and structure of each panel. Right? So the panel size and shape has a temporal quality. Okay, so now that the code and grammar of the visual language of the graphic narrative has been established, we'll just say it's established, it only remains to define the syntax and how a complete visual system of syntactical relations amounts to a justification of a given narrative's narrativity, right? A given graphic text's narrativity. Unfortunately, we won't have a whole lot of time to delve very deeply into graphic syntax. Nevertheless, a few short observations can be made through an exploration of Chris Ware's Jimmy Corrigan. Briefly look at some graphic syntax. And this is where the topic gets a little hairy, because there are a lot of different definitions about syntax and its relationship to narrative and to storytelling. Right? But although definitions of narrative syntax vary widely in their terms, perspectives, and their basic approaches, the definition forwarded here follows that of William Labov and Frederick Amory. So they are theorists very active in the 70s and 80s, but still current today. And what they said was, narrative syntax is to be conceived as a paratactic sequence of independent clauses whose verb actions match a corresponding order of events. So something happening. The utility of this formulation of narrative syntax can be found not only in its applicability to all manner of media and forms of communicative expression, but also on its focus upon the generative nature of the movement from clause to paratactically juxtaposed clause. So how clauses relate to other clauses within some sort of statement. So if we recall Chapman's definition of narrative as communication, right, the movement of arrows from left to right, and MacLeod's concept of closure, right, this definition also asserts that narrative syntax is reliant upon the specific grammatical ordering of the depicted events as they occur in a given sequence. So the way that they're put together creates the syntax. So we can see very, very basic syntax here. The rules are implied through the closure that this cat or this mouse figure is hitting a cat head. Right? We are told very little of how to read this, but we assume, if we're moving from left to right, that some sort of hitting action is taking place. So we can think of these as independent clauses, but if we think of them as independent, then they float alone. But if we think of them as having some sort of syntax, then we need to connect them as two parts to a statement, right? Perhaps the subject introducing the characters, introducing the action, and then we have a kind of object construction here in the second panel, which gives us the closure, which gives us some sort of action taking place. We have a kind of subject, verb, and object agreement, right? Of course, the verb is kind of falling here in the closure space, right, in the gutter. We have to assume that action is taking place. There's no way for us to prove it. It happens only cognitively. As described in the previous analysis of visual grammar, the sequential ordering varies in meaning depending on how the items depending on the items involved in each transition. So it really depends on what sort of material we have in each panel. Nevertheless, it is the vectored movement from transition to transition over a range of items and events that specifies the syntactical rules of a narrative text. So again, the narrative text in graphic terms is creating its own syntax. Every author has his own kind of signature syntax. In the self-professed interest of introducing the reader to the rules of graphic syntax, Ware's Jimmy Corrigan begins with a purely graphic exposition of the set of syntactical rules necessary for a literate reading of the visual language applied in the novel. So it's a kind of key to reading the novel, and he gives it at the beginning of his work. And it's incredibly detailed. And I really would like you to have had a copy so you could look at the detail here and sort of read the symbolic language here. but I'll have to do it for you. But this is on, I think, the first or second page of his book, right? And he's basically saying to the reader, this is how this work is going to go. Right? This is the syntax of this graphic text. So if you understand the rules as I'm using them, then you'll be fine. But if you can't figure this out, then maybe you need a little bit of practice. So he's giving us a run-through before we even get to the beginning of the novel, which is very kind. Okay. Although Ware's diagram may initially appear quite daunting in its incredible intricacy, careful attention to the interaction of its parts and the propositions suggested by its interlinked network of vectors reveals that in this relatively small diagram, taking up about 2/3 of a page, Ware has not only succeeded in graphically explaining the syntax of visual language, this diagram also elucidates several of the spatio-temporal structures involved in the sequential graphic storytelling, and presents a very convincing and theoretically sophisticated case for the cognitive nature of graphic narratives in general, all without recourse to any verbal language more extensive than etc., or, and see above. Right? So those are the few tiny little verbal clues that he spices it with. But otherwise, it's almost entirely graphic. The diagram begins in the top left section, up here, with a description of how the eye, in the presence of light, receives an image in the form of a wave, the image in question being a simple line drawing of a stylized mouse striking a bodiless cat's head with a hammer. Right, so the light enters the eye and something happens. This wave, reflecting the shapes and colors in the image, is described as being interpreted by the brain before being reproduced in the mind or memory as an approximation of the image on the page. So it goes in the eye, into the brain. Something is being recognized, and it is entering the memory. Following the vectors leading from the top, the diagram explains that each image in a graphic sequence is conveyed to the brain in a similar fashion. Right? So this is an ongoing process. And following a further vector, the diagram explains that each of these cognitive acts of translating light data into mentally reproduced imagery takes place over a period of time. So this isn't instantaneous. This is timed. This, the diagram suggests, is the basis of the sequential nature of panel-to-panel spatio-temporal transition. So as panels move, time goes on. And that's where closure occurs. Linked to the bottom of the row of panels, describing this sequence further. Sorry, let me start that again. Linked to the bottom of the row of panels describing this sequence is a further explanation of how time is involved in the cognitive linking of sequential panels, shown by an overlapping of the components of two example events. So A plus B. So we have a sequence here, and we have sort of a beginning and an end. And here in this ghostly section in between is the suggestion that some action is occurring, which gives us a few choices. Immediately below these three panels are another three panels separated by or. The first panel on the left suggests that the two sequential panels depicting separate events can be linked by coded signs within the panel. And so we have an encoding here. And as you go through it, different parts of the comic reading process are described. So we have the brain And I'm sorry, it's very small, it's hard to see, but this is a brain, and it is being likened to its relationship to books. So just as the brain likes books, the brain can also like reading visual material. Also, the eye is being connected to a proscenium arch here. So it's suggesting that the comics scholarship is similar to a kind of stage performance, right? The kind of play that's going on the page is akin to a theatrical performance, right? Likewise, these wavy lines coming down to this musical note give us a sense of musicality, right? And musicality in the graphic is, of course, graphic. But it is suggested by, of course, style, color, page layout, right? And like music, it's reliant upon a certain sense of size, right? And again, as I said earlier, right, the size of the panel indicates the amount of time necessary to cognitively deal with it, right? You have a large panel, it very physically, very actively takes you more time to process it, whereas a very small, simple panel is much more immediate. Right? And the author plays with that timing and is very aware of that. So that's something that the reader should also be aware of. Right? And in these panels, we get more examples of how sequences occur and how sort of anthropomorphization can occur. Right? We have this mouse turning into a man, for example, or a cat turning into a man. In this further panel, we see the use of kind of graphic adjectives. Right? When we stereotype, when we give props to our characters, right? When we tell a story, the visual adjectives or adverbs are the kind of things that they are gifted with as objects to use in that story or that sequence. So that's being described here as well. So all in one page, Ware is giving us an incredibly detailed and sophisticated lesson in how to read graphic narratives. Anyway, I'll wrap up. So final suggestions, now that we've looked at the code, the grammar, and the syntax. And those were the sticking points of Ryan's definition of narrative. So I think we've adequately recognized that this does occur within graphic narrative. So still, some final suggestions. As each of the analyzed texts makes adequately apparent, Ryan's conditions of narrativity, as well as Worth's proposed narratological requirements of code, grammar, and syntax, are all abundantly discernible in the graphic structures and cognitive processes involved in the creation and interpretation of the contemporary graphic novel. Of course, as the parallel fields of narratology and comics scholarship continue to develop and expand, new unforeseen connections and further theoretical divides are likely to manifest themselves. However, it is hoped that the approach taken today in this workshop does more to foster an increased exchange of ideas rather than to delimit the scope. For it's important to recognize that while the burgeoning field of comic scholarship has very little to lose by an exclusion from narratology, it's quite obvious that narratology would be losing something if graphic language appreciation and the analysis of graphic grammar and syntax were not brought in, right? So this is more of a project for improving narratology, right? Because they have quite a bit to lose if they don't appreciate nonverbal narrative. And that's my stump that I stand on. So thank you very much for your attention.
I'll maybe ask some questions for the project.
Thank you. Anything at all? Yes.
I really enjoyed the talk.
Thank you.
I wanted to ask about about the necessity to stick to a certain syntactic structure. I'm very convinced about how graphic narratives are in lines with the narrative or the syntactic standards and the syntactic structure of language. But I'm not an expert on graphic narratives at all, but can graphic narratives come up with a language of its own? I have in mind the illustrations of Blake in his poetry.
Sure.
I don't think that is in lines with a syntactic structure where you have an SVO or SOV or anything like that.
That's right.
I also work on performance. So, in Chennai, in Tamil theatre, we have a lot of experiments with primordial sounds and all that. So, what is that? It is not in lines with the standard, syntactic structure of language. So, isn't that narrative?
Indeed, yes. I think it's, well, especially dance and even any kind of use of sound in dance has a specific purpose, right? It might have a symbolic coding, right? It might have some sort of cultural meaning as well, or it might just be punctuation between gestures or postures, right? And that's part of the storytelling process as well. But I think any kind of tradition, any kind of genre will establish its own conventions, right? And with those conventions comes a kind of standard syntax, right? As we've seen in some of the examples, right? Using square panels is kind of a very typical way of showing a story on a page. You don't have to use squares, but it's just it's easy, it's readable, right? And the sense that one page makes one statement, right? It operates on the level of a kind of paragraph is another conventional development that has just occurred. Some of these are very actively being played with by the artist, right? Some artists try to develop their own syntax, right? Getting away from square panels, for example. But it's always risky, right? If you do develop your own syntax, if you give up on the conventional syntax and try your own, it's at your own peril, right? It's risky to do so. But I do think there are a lot of artists that are playing with the form more and more to try to expand it, to try to expand it, not only to expand it for the sense of making it bigger, but also to avoid it being locked into something constricting, right? Because like any kind of grammar or syntax, the rules can disallow certain things. So at least within the graphic, I think that's something that's continuously being pushed and pulled on. And I think probably within dance as well, right? You can choose to bring on certain things or ignore certain things. But if you ignore those conventions, maybe you're starting a new genre, right? Maybe it's no longer what it came from. So that would be my answer. Thank you.
I could just add on, because I was fascinated with the allusion to Blake that you made.
Yeah.
I was wondering if there's any scholarship done in the field of narratology, looking at Blake as one of the early anticipators of the graphic narrative. Sketching, etching, writing together.
Yeah, definitely. He's brought up frequently. And whether he is a narrative illustrator or whether we can think of these as graphic narratives is a question that comes up. Personally, I think there are some of his works that have a narrative quality, others that are purely illustrative, right? They're meant to enact moments from his poetry or from mythology, etc. But I do think there is a very direct line between Blake and his works and what artists such as Chris Ware are doing today. Right? That it's not happening in a vacuum, that's for sure.
since you have worked with Japanese students, so I would like to know how your experience has been in how that these codes and of visual narratives are created in manga. Especially because manga is usually serialized, so the way these codes are developed and given their own narrativity, how is it related to their being serialized in the sense that their inclusion in the narrative is a gradual process instead of having been planted into the narrative like fully formed.
Hmm. Can you repeat the last part?
In the sense, like there are long-running mangas like One Piece and Naruto nowadays. So they include a serialized way of inserting codes in the narrative.
Right, right.
They start a thing and then it becomes a thing which is very typical of that manga.
Right, right.
And then it acquires a narrative meaning of its own.
I think that's true, right. And that's one thing that I think narratologists in this area are starting to think about, is that these when we think about this as a story world, right? And One Piece, for example, Naruto, maybe even Superman, right? Some of these story worlds overlap, right? We have the Marvel world, and the Marvel world has a kind of similarity between the characters, right? And they can come together as a team, right? The Avengers, for example. But when they're in their own separate story worlds, their sort of comic physics can be very different, right? The comic physics of Peanuts, right, Charles Schultz, is very different from the Marvel world of superheroes, right? Here, Charlie Brown can be strong and maybe jump off of a building, but he's going to probably hit his face on the ground, right? It doesn't have the same physics that we get in Superman, right? And so what makes those realms different and unique is, I think, what some theorists are just starting to think about, right? That there is not just one graphic comic story world. There are as many as there are artists drawing them. And I think that as those works get serialized, that sense of story world integrity is increased. Right? So I think it's in the artist's interest to keep serializing, to sort of gel their sense of that story world. Right? And I think at least my students enjoy that serial quality because they're having that sense of otherworldly reality confirmed again and again, and it's satisfying.
So instead of like Western comic tradition focuses on being metafictional while trying the formal limitations of the genre.
Right.
While the Eastern manga, they tend to be hyper real.
Right, right.
In their exploration of the.
That's true. That's a good point. Right. I think artists, even from the very beginning, some of the early animators before, but at the same, well, even before Disney, were constantly playing with the media, right? And showing us, yes, this is animated. This is a hand drawing a dinosaur, and this is the dinosaur hitting the camera, right? So that kind of metafictional quality was there from the beginning, I think, especially with the West. But as you said, in Eastern, especially Japanese comics, there's hyper-reality, but there's not that sense of breaking the wall, right? You don't let them cross over. But especially American illustrators love the crossover, love to play with theoretical ideas of authorship and agency. So it's a little bit of a different thing. All right. So nice comment. Thank you.
I was just thinking about specific moments within the graphic novel where you also sort of, and I mean, you kind of really need it when you're going through the book, when you kind of distances you from the story itself. And
Right.
once there are breaks in the narrative, I mean, it services the story, but it also serves, like, the cutouts of the paper models.
Right, right.
So, how do you make sense of that within the narrative?
Right. He's very playful. And he doesn't want us to know everything, right? He's very much of the pro-aeretic side of coding rather than the hermeneutic, right? He goes sequence to sequence, but he wants to maintain that suspense. And so I think those cutouts, for example, you can make your own. In this work, he gives us a couple of pages where we can cut out the page and make our own little story world in 3D. Right? You can cut out the little house and put the little figures who are the characters in the story. We can make our own little diorama of the novel and maybe play out our own version. And it's fascinating because nobody else does that. But it does create a break in the sequencing. Right? It's an artificial pause. But it doesn't really jolt us back to reality. It puts us in another kind of playful spot. Right? We're being asked to be children in a certain sense and play with toys and enjoy the act of constructing. So these are all kind of signposts to the narrativity, right? It's a reminder of this is a story, this is created, but it's also a reminder that, yeah, well, we always do that. That's what we do. We are always imagining. We're constantly making up stories, having memories, creating story worlds in our own lives. So it's a kind of meta sidestepping where there's a pause. There's a kind of peaceful pause, very playful, peaceful, innocent pause before we're brought back. And we, as you said, we might not be brought back where we were left off. Right? There are jolts in time, jolts in memory. And I think Chris Ware really wants us to remember that everything's made up. It's all a story. That we shouldn't take things so seriously because we're not good at remembering things sometimes. All right. Thank you.
So could you just ask one quick one in relation to what you already said? When you talk about metafiction in this Greco medium, how do you feature in something like metalepsis into all the things of narrative versions which come in, sometimes meaninglessly?
Sure.
Would that feature in this kind of debate at all, along with metafiction?
Definitely. And I think Jimmy Corrigan is a perfect example because he's a kind of, it's never clear where or when he is. But we know that he's in this city that's kind of like Chicago. And there's a kind of Chicago in history as the background. But he wears short trousers, right? Very sort of 1910 sort of newsboy trousers. But he seems to be living in 20th century Chicago, right? So there's this kind of anachronism to him as a character. And he sort of floats in and out between his own memories and the constructed memory of his grandfather's time 100 years before. So there's this kind of overlapping of character, there's this anachronism and these sort of fading ins and fading outs, and metalepsis, like constantly being sort of jolted in and out of time periods. It's very much a part of the structure of that novel. But it's never established for sure where or when we are. And I think the author plays with that to his benefit, right? To keep you constantly wondering, I think, is one of the beautiful parts of that narrative. Other of his works tend to be more fixed, but requiring different things of you. He's very much a demanding graphic artist. He expects a high level of consideration and a lot of your time. He expects a lot of your time. So if you ever get into Chris Ware studies, be prepared to spend a lot of time. It's like reading Joyce, right? Only graphic Joyce, right? So, hi.
We've got Mike Lewison now to bring the session to a close. Thank the speaker one more time. It's been a really interesting session. And thank you all for coming. Thank you.
Thank you.